guests when we finish. But I wanted to say welcome to you. Thanks for coming. And we're really fortunate tonight to have two outstanding guests. So Terry Waite is the Assistant for Anglican Communion Affairs for the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Ramsey, in the 1980s. As an envoy for the Church of England, travelled to Lebanon and tried to secure the release of 4 hostages, including the general from the trial. He was a successful hostage negotiator, but when visiting Lebanon, he was himself kidnapped and held captive for much of that time in solitary confinement from 1987 to 1991. After his release, he came to Trinity Hall, where he wrote Taking on Trust, a memoir about his experiences. Since his release, he's become involved in a number of humanitarian causes and much charitable work, including supporting long-term community victims. Dr. Adrian Grounds is an honorary research fellow here at He's a forensic scientist with research interests in the needs that mental disorder, business and vision. We dedicated much of our psychological consequences of the wrongful imprisonment, including carrying out detailed psychological assessments, particularly in wrongful. I know that this work, this project is sustained and painful. In this conversation, our students with experience speakers will inquire together about the effects of wrongful imprisonment, drawing on their personal and professional encounters. Our light structure means they should move in their conversation from entry and change over time to release. I'll do a bit of light steering if needed, but maybe not needed. And to start us off, I would like to ask each of them to introduce themselves in their own way. So, Terry.
All right, well, thank you, Alison, and it's good to be here today. I think, having just negotiated Cambridge traffic, I think it's better to be a hostage. But seriously, going back, my experience with hostages goes back probably 50 years, when I negotiated at what one might call a higher level with General Amin. You probably remember the Uganda coup, when Obote was overthrown and Amin came to power. I was living in Uganda at the time, and many of my colleagues were taken. Many were murdered because they belonged to the wrong tribe or the wrong political group. And I attempted to release some of them and was able to release a few, but I'm afraid many of my friends and colleagues didn't know at that time. And that was my first, major experience of working at that level in such extremely difficult and demanding circumstances. I went on then to travel the world and worked in probably most of the troubled spots of the world, working to try and work for reconciliation, and often working with so-called terrorist groups in southern Philippines, India, Africa, South America, right across the world. Then, to come more up to date, when I was appointed as a special assistant to the Archbishop of Canterbury, I should explain, by the way, that I'm not ordained. I've never had a vocation to the ordained ministry. I'm a layperson. When I was appointed to that position, there was an outbreak of hostage taking. First of all, because of the Iranian Revolution, when a number of people were, many people were taken, of course, but a number of British citizens were taken, and of course a considerable number of Iranians. And I went out to Iran and negotiated with the Revolutionary Guards and was able to obtain the release of 8 or 9 people without payment and without false exchange, purely negotiating with revolutionary guards. Then later on with Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, who you may remember in Libya, who met a very unpleasant end, when again British people were taken. The reason I became involved was not because I was always looking for these events or these occasions. It's because families who were in distress knew something of my background and turned to me for help when they were not, so they said, not getting sufficient support or help from the British Foreign Office, who in those days were not particularly good at maintaining a relationship with hostage families. They did have a relationship, but it was superficial. They've changed dramatically in the last years. So I negotiated the key, and again was successful. A number of other events, which I won't bore you with, but Beirut was, again, a time when, as Alison said, John McCarthy, Brian Keane and others were taken. And I, again, at the request of families, went out to Beirut and was a victim of political duplicity, which I can explain, but I'm not going to now, but if you want to ask at any time, I'm glad to explain it. And found myself in captivity as a hostage myself for 5 years, almost 5 years, not quite. 4 3/4 of those years were in very strict solitary confinement with no books, papers, etc., just lying on the floor, sitting on the floor. And then after 5 years of an unusual experience, I was released, and as Alison said, I came to Trinity Hall, to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude for their support during those years. And I've done various other things since, but I think that's enough for me. Rather too long.
Thank you. Well, it's a great privilege to contribute, particularly to do so with Terry, and just want to begin also just with our congratulations on your recent knighthood.
Oh, thank you.
For all the work that you've done.
Previously, it's only waiters who call me sir. And they wanted to tell me.
I'm conscious that a fundamental difference between us is that Terry has suffered terrible and prolonged captivity. I can only report on the accounts I've heard from others who've been wrongly imprisoned, and in conditions that in many ways are simply incommensurate with the conditions that you would have experienced. Just a minute or two of context about that work. So as I said, my background's in forensic psychiatry. Between 1989 and 2016, I saw 64 individuals who'd been wrongly convicted and released from long-term imprisonment. The reasons for quashing their convictions included unreliable prosecution witnesses, unreliable eyewitness testimony, police fabrication of written statements, unreliable confessions, discredited forensic evidence, non-disclosure of significant material to the defence. And I was asked primarily to provide reports in relation to compensation. So the focus of these assessments was on documenting how they've been affected, and particularly on the question of psychological damage. There were 61 men, 3 women, 36 had been convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The duration of imprisonment averaged 10 years. So those who'd been in for longest had lost a generation of family life. Young men who entered prison as fathers of young children could be released as grandfathers with grandchildren at the age their children were when they went in. I didn't expect initially to find much evidence of any psychiatric harm. This was the late 1980s. It was a time when our previous director, the late Nigel Walker, had written in 1987, I quote, "Research in British prisons, chiefly by psychologists, has done much to deflate the sweeping exaggerations, chiefly by sociologists, about the ill effects of ordinary incarceration. Very much of Walkerish, wholly out of date, and thank goodness for Alison and her colleagues who've corrected the picture in the years since. It was a different world. But what emerged from the interviews was unexpected and overwhelming. Much later, I found it was the clinical literature on war veterans and their adjustment problems on returning home that was by far the most illuminating for beginning to try and understand what I was seeing. The first and most striking feature was that most of the wrongly convicted were described by their families after release as changed in personality, and in ways that caused distress to them and those who knew them. They were typically described as distant, estranged, lacking capacity for intimacy, mistrustful, unable to settle. They'd lost a sense of purpose and direction. So there was a kind of enduring personality change. Over half had post-traumatic stress disorder, usually arising from life-threatening experiences following arrest or in custody. About half in prison suffered from depressive and anxiety disorders during their years inside, and since release, a higher proportion, about 2/3, had experienced such conditions. In prison, they were typically isolated in their claims of innocence. They experienced family losses and separations, and where there were visits, they were painful. But it was after release that the effects became most evident. First of all, there was no refuge or system of help for them with the transition from custody. Typically, they went to the Court of Appeal and were released. And so they didn't have help of the kind that was provided for Terry and other hostages, and that Terry has promoted in the years since. For those who returned to families, there was often estrangement, particularly from children. The wrongly convicted had been changed by prison life. They continued to experience stigma and what Laura Tilt and Carolyn Hoyle have termed spoiled identities. Most had persisting and deep feelings of bitterness, loss, and injustice. But 20 years ago, by which time I'd seen, I think, 18 men, all men at that point, I wrote this. In summary, the forms of suffering and damage experienced by these men and their families were numerous. They interacted and compounded one another and led to secondary problems. The life courses of those involved were permanently changed. The men suffered losses of relationships, prospects, and years of their expected life history. The harms extended over time and generations. The distress was often severe. When families confided that the time since the man's release has been worse than the years in prison, and when the men admitted that sometimes they wished they were back inside, it was a measure of the burdens they experienced. And that was an attempt to sort of just provide an overall summary of what I was seeing. I have to say, 20 years on, that despair, and it was despair, has lightened a little, because some, many years later, did find new and happier lives in ways that neither of us could foresee or indeed hope for at the time I saw them. So that's just a summary. Perhaps I should begin. We're going to, I think, try and have a dialogue about entry to custody, experience during custody, the transition, life after release, and so on. But just beginning with the experience of initial captivity. One of the things for the wrongly convicted, Terry, was how many of them, this was a completely unanticipated event. It was bewildering. It seemed unreal. They had great difficulty in just accepting the reality of what happened. And of course, they'd been accused unjustly of something they hadn't done. And perhaps we could just begin by just asking about your views about the ways in which entry to custody for you and other hostages is similar or different, or was similar or different.
Well, I think it was different insofar as if you engage in that dangerous occupation of negotiating for the release of hostages. And if you decide that the way in which you're going to approach that is to try and get to the key leaders of the movement who've captured hostages, then you're taking an enormous risk. And you know there's a chance of either being killed or captured. That doesn't mean to say you don't take what precautions you can, but you are extremely vulnerable. And every time I went on any mission, I recognized that fact, but I put it to the back of my mind. I didn't allow it to dominate my thoughts, but at the same time, as I said, I took proper reasonable precautions as far as I could. You can never lower the element of risk. So when captivity did take place, when I was huge, I just tell the story, so it's in some context. I'd been out to Beirut many times and was able to meet with the hostage takers face to face, and had a number of conversations with them, and was making some very slow progress. And then at one point, they said to me that I hadn't been allowed to see hostages face to face in the past. I'd been able to obtain proof of life through photographs and what have you, but I hadn't been able to see them face to face. They then said that I would be able to see them face to face. And I, at that point, doubted their sincerity. And I had to decide what to do. They told me that one of the hostages was sick, ill, and about to die. And because of that, I could go and see him. Well, I had to make a decision. And I do believe that when you do something for other people, it's never, ever purely altruistic. I mean, you're doing something for yourself, consciously or unconsciously. And my feelings were, if that man dies, if I hadn't got the courage of my convictions to go and see him, I'm going to have to live with my conscience for the rest of my life. Now you can argue there's a person most, which I think is reasonable, but it's there. So I went, and instead of letting me see the individual, I found myself in an underground prison with no natural light. I was chained to the wall for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day for 5 years, almost 5 years. I slept on the floor, no books or papers for 3.5 years, no companionship for almost 5 years, and no conversation. It was an interesting story. I used to say to my guards initially when I was captured, does it not say in the Quran, you mustn't steal? I said, oh, no, I mustn't steal. I said, how is it you steal me from my family? You know, you take my life. They said, we'd better go and ask the chief about that. So they went away. A couple of weeks later, they came back and said, the chief said we mustn't talk to you anymore. No further than that. So it was a situation of very complete isolation and having to somehow learn how to survive in that situation.
Reading your book, I remember you talked about how you began with 3 principles, which were no
regrets, no self-pity, and no false sentimentality.
Yes.
I don't know where those 3 points came from, but they certainly came into my head. So do not regret what you've done because you have behaved in the way that you thought appropriate. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Don't feel, for goodness sake, sorry for yourself. because I'd worked in many, many parts of the world. I'd seen people in far worse conditions than I was experiencing. And so I said, you mustn't allow self-pity to get into this, into your feeling. And over sentimentality, well, that is, just don't be over sentimental about things. Try and face each day as it comes.
I mean, just thinking about the conversations with people who were wrongly convicted, there were so many basic differences. I think many, they didn't anticipate. They didn't know how to deal. Many of them thought it was unreal. Every time they heard steps coming, they would talk about how every time they heard steps coming down the landing, they thought someone was going to come down and say, sorry, you made a mistake. And you can go home. And for them, I mean, their emotional reactions varied, but for many there was rage, there was depression, there was bewilderment. There was one point of, I think, on the point of no self-pity, no regrets. They did, many of them, find a way of coping by just blocking out painful thoughts. They did not think, for example, about the family. Some of them stopped family visits because they were just they were too painful.
Sure, well,
and that sort of thing.
That's a very important point, I think. I mean, first of all, one major difference is in the majority of cases where people are wrongfully imprisoned, when you're a hostage, you have no idea whether you're going to be there for years, whether somebody opens the door, not that you're going to be released necessarily, but you're going to be either killed or tortured. But I was tortured, and I did have a mock execution. So those two things happened. But you constantly were living in that sort of tension, knowing that your life was on the edge. And as for family, that is a very interesting point, because at the time, my two elder daughters were just beginning university, and two other children finishing high school or in high school. And it would have been easy to constantly think about them, and also worry that by me was in fact affecting them detrimentally. But I had to put them to the back of my mind. I had to, and I was rather glad that that I was able to do that. It doesn't mean to say for one moment that you don't care for them. It just means to say you cannot bear that thought. Now, the interesting point is, relating to what you say, at the moment, I'm in a fortnightly conversation with a prisoner overseas who's able to communicate with me through his consulate by telephone, and we speak every couple of weeks. And whilst that, and he's also got contact with his wife, and he's constantly distressed because his wife is expressing her distress and the problems that are facing the family, and they're piling on him. He relieves some of that. So in some ways, I can well understand why the necessity to put family right to the back of your mind. Yeah.
Well, some of the, as I said, there were some who stopped family visits. That they quite often in the families both describe how they conducted visits by actually trying to hide what they were going through, because they wanted to support the other and reassure them that they were fine. And of course, when that went on for 10 or 15 years, afterwards, they had any idea really what they'd been through. And for the prisoners, I can recall the prisoners talking about the photographs of the children, You needed them, but sometimes you just had to put them away, and then you had to get them up again. And you would torment yourself by thinking, well, what are the children look like now? And it was, and it was huge stress. It was just easier to block it off for me.
Well, interesting enough, since release, which is a long time ago now, it's 30 years ago, I've never had an in-depth discussion with any of my family about that experience. I've never done it. And I'm not quite sure why. Would it be because I might find that too painful, or they might find it too painful? Now, when we came out, we did get supportive help, and individual family members were able to get supportive help, never correctly. And it was an interesting point. I've never done it.
And in terms of the resources in yourself that you drew on, I mean, I was again struck reading your book and comparing it with what the accounts I had from others. So many people I spoke to, they had very limited personal resources in terms of life experience and education to cope cognitively and emotionally well with what they were going through. Some had very adverse upbringings, and ironically, some of those who actually did, those who tended to do rather better through this experience, were those who were quite young and unstable, didn't have families, hadn't really started any careers. And some of those men matured in prison, gained intellectually, and coped much better afterwards than those who had achieved a family life, had careers, and it was all gone. And they coped much more poorly in the long term. But in terms of dealing with the captivity, I mean, to what extent did you draw on? Well, you drew a lot of memory, but also the traditions within the church. The importance of the liturgy, things of that kind structured your time and day.
Yeah, what I found necessary to do in a situation where almost all resources were absent. I mean, you were there by yourself, sitting on the floor, often in the dark, with nothing. So, what do you draw on? You draw on memory, and you draw on imagination. Those two things. Now, interesting about memory, I discovered in that experience, it was as though there were holes in my memory, if I can put it like that. I had known people who held a high position in British intelligence, knew them, and knew the person. And yet, when I came to try and remember their names, they'd gone completely. I could not think, nor could I think of how I came to have initial contact with the captors. It had gone from memory, as though there was a hole there. Now, was that protective mechanism working within me? Possibly. But it was definitely the case. And yet I could remember with great clarity events from childhood. And I began to go through them, and I began to write them. I had no pencil and paper. And I thought, here is an opportunity now to go back and begin to write, which eventually resulted in the book that you mentioned. And I began to do that. And it was all here. And I began to develop my memory. And then I discovered, and I was fortunate, you spoke about background, which I think is definitely important. Where you've had an impoverished childhood, where you've not had a decent family life or a reasonable education, or you've not been a reader. You've been simply, stuck in front of the TV, maybe, or YouTube or something. You've never had anything, no reading ability. You're impoverished. And I was always an avid reader in childhood. I used to own second-hand bookshops for books. And so I could recall what I'd read. And then I also found, for the first time in my life, that I was beginning to write poetry. Now, in the past, I've never been a particular aficionado of poetry. It wasn't something I appreciated. But I began to do that. I've never been thinking about it later. But why am I doing that? Why am I trying to find this harmony of words? And I think the answer to that is I was trying to find and establish some degree of inner harmony, some degree of inner harmony. And language was a way of doing that. We're finding that inner harmony, and somehow keeping myself together. Now, if I hadn't had that background, I'd be definitely impoverished and definitely in a much more difficult state.
Going back to what you said about the not talking to the family about what you've been through, again, that echoes what many of the convicted people said. Their explanation for it was that it would be impossible for them to properly understand what I've been through. They could talk to other people who've been wrongly convicted as well. And indeed, some of them spent the subsequent time campaigning for other wrongly convicted people and felt closer to their own families. And thinking about it, of course, this was a very long period in custody for them. I mean, average 10 years. This really had been their life for a decade. I think many of them didn't even try to talk about it. From a family's point of view, some of them saw the release, the person who'd been released from prison as far too. They seemed so preoccupied with their prison life, and they couldn't put it behind them, and that distressed the kind of. They knew that they were stuck in prison, as well, in their minds, in their behaviour, in their sense of bitterness and injustice that never went away, and families couldn't shift from that. And it led to all sorts of conflicts, actually. There was a very, one particular occasion that comes to mind is there was one occasion where the wife of one of the men threw away his boxes of papers that he accumulated during his time in prison. She thought this was good for him, it would just help him move on. He was beside himself with distress. He said she didn't understand. Those boxes of paper were my life. That was my work. And it just showed the complete failure of mutual understanding. It was very, very striking.
Interesting. When I eventually came out, with all my family, we went to an RAF base and had a separate wing where we could be isolated and separate. And I was totally overwhelmed because not just my immediate family turned up, but cousins and relatives and people I hardly ever knew. Yeah. And I was totally swamped by them. It's far too much. I just couldn't take it. And I couldn't even sit down and have a meal with my immediate family for about 2 weeks. I had a separate room, and they had rooms in the place. I used to get up in the middle of the night and eat in the middle of the night. and then go back to my room and then meet them at the day. It took me quite a long time to begin. And then, of course, Trinity Hall came into the picture, and I was elected to a fellowship of the fellow commoner there. And I lived in college during the middle part of the weekends and took it in stages. That was the best thing I could have done. I mean, people from the outside said, oh, that fellow, let's see, his family's breaking up, his marriage is breaking up, it's all going to, he's not being exposed. And many people couldn't understand why you didn't come back to really embrace big family celebration, but I couldn't do it.
Well, it was, you know, it was just the same for those who were suddenly released from the Court of Appeal. I mean, they would just describe how, you know, there would be a big gathering, and they very quickly, they absolutely couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
It was too noisy, it was too emotional, too many people. One man described his daughter, who by then grown up when she was really young, quite a young child when he met him, was there with her boyfriend sitting on her knee, and he absolutely couldn't cope with it, and had just had to get away, and some they'd isolate themselves at home. Their room was as the cell had been. The families receiving was, you know, the families wanted to engage socially, they couldn't. But the problem was the families didn't understand it,
Yeah.
and they didn't understand it themselves. But it sounds like the people who looked after you and your family on release did understand it.
Yes, they did. They did. But it was also another story, because things came to me from different angles. I mean, it was a big story in the press and in the media generally. And one had to face all the different things that the media was saying. Now, I'll give you one example. When I came home, I first of all was flown to Cyprus, spent the night in the hospital in Cyprus. And then from Cyprus, on an RAF flight back to this country. And a colleague of mine came out to Cyprus, not a family member, but a colleague, to be with me on that last leg of the journey. And he said to me, he said, when you get to London, there'll be a large press contingent. He said, I would suggest that you make a statement to the press, get them all together, make one statement, and then go meet your family, rather than the other way around. So, because I think you might find it rather too emotional to do it the other way around. And I agreed with him. I thought it was a good point. So we landed at Lynham, and literally there were hundreds of people. Enormous press conference. Literally hundreds of people. Television cameras, news reporters, and so on and so forth. So I made my statement. Then I went to meet with my family. Fine, that was all right. A week later, there was an article in the newspaper which said, what do you make of a media junkie like Terry Wade, who meets the press before he meets his family? And, you know, that was that really caught me. And I thought, I'm not going to listen to any more news at the moment. We're going to cut off. I'm not going to listen to what the radio was saying. I mean, it changed afterwards. I mean, you give it time and things change and develop. But that was a pretty hard blow. Okay.
I mean, one big difference with the people, those who released after wrongful conviction, probably a very different in the sense that one of the burdens that they can is continuing stigma, continuing suspicion that they were probably guilty. They don't get apologies. They don't hardly ever. They don't get any sort of public recognition of innocence usually. I mean, they'll get a court finding that the convictions are unsafe, and that's about as far as it goes for it. So they can go out and continue to be very, many of them very, very fearful of being rearrested. Frightened to go out, couldn't go out without company for a long time, and much of that continues, and that could continue for years. I went to visit one man who lived in a ground floor flat in London, and outside his flat there was some bare earth outside his main window. Every night he raked that earth so that in the morning he could see if there were any footprints for people who suspected were putting his life at risk. And that constant fear of rearrest, sense of panic when you see police officers. Now, all that, I guess, is different. Or, I mean, was there any sort of fear of repetition in your experience?
Just before I answer that, just a couple of points that related to what you said previously about reaction of hostages. I mean, one hostage who was captured at the same time as myself. He became extremely aggressive. And when guards came into the cell, he actually, although he was chained, he actually tried and go for them. Of course, consequently, he was beaten severely, so badly beaten, he couldn't hardly lie down. And I wondered, I looked at that, I thought to myself, well, why is he doing that? And I think it was his way of establishing his identity. Saying, look, you've not got me, and I'm still going to fight to the end. Yes. And he did that. Yeah. Now, there was another hostage who seemingly cut off all internal communication with himself or with other people, wouldn't speak to anybody. And he cut it off. And he fell into deep mental disorder, deep depression. And so bad that when he was released, he had to go to psychiatric treatment. But he cut off that inner voice.
Yeah.
One of the things one had to learn to do was to somehow converse with yourself creatively. Keep that conversation going within yourself. There's no one else to converse with, so keep it moving. You also mentioned about structure, which I didn't answer. Structure that you often in the dark, you don't know when it's day or night sometimes. When I was completely in the dark for several days, I became extremely disorientated. Because I'd wake up, I think it was morning, it was probably 3 in the morning or something like that. Eventually I could meet at the time because we were near a mosque and I could hear call from the minaret morning and the night. So that gave me a structure. But I found it very important to try and build a structure for the day. So much time for thinking, so much time for this, that, and the other exercise, without limited exercise you can do. You can have that sort of thing. And then as far as symbolic life goes, and I'm brought up as an Anglican, accustomed to the communion service. And each day I saved a little bread and some water in the cup. And I said to myself, the communion service, which I, again, remembered. I can remember it word for word. Now, that was, as I look back on it now, and I remember at the time, saying, look, I am doing this here, but I'm also linking with thousands of other people who are doing the same around the world. So in my mind, I was free. I was at liberty. My mind gave me the liberty to be there in that way. And that was a structured event which kept me in balance, if you like, but linked me with other people. And one could be linked through one's mind and one's imagination. As for religious belief, I never ever believed that if you have a particular faith, or if you have a Christian faith, that's going to make you immune to the normal ups and downs of life. I think you take your own your own chance on that. What I think it does do, a simple example, is to give you resources that enable you to maintain yourself through times of extreme difficulty. It doesn't mean to say you're going to be suddenly released because you've got a belief. Not a bit. So those are some of the things that I should have answered before. But
I mean, your colleague who expressed anger and rage when the guards came in, just reminded me that again a few people whose mode of managing in prison was rebellion and being oppositional. And on release, some of them hated the idea of coming to see a psychiatrist because the whole premise of the meeting was to find out had they been damaged, basically. And the one thing they wanted to insist on was that the system has not succeeded in damaging them. Thank you very much. So one massive, and that you know, one just had to respect. That was difficult. One had to respect that, and they tended actually to so commonly understate what they've been through and how they changed and what they've found. But afterwards, it was family members who lived with them who could give much more vivid accounts of their problems than they would.
well, so much depends, I think, on your attitude and the way in which you take this experience. Obviously, one was not happy about the experience, not happy about being captured for one moment. But what I learned to say to myself was, you still have life. Take this now as an opportunity to get to know yourself better, to go more inwardly, if you like, to be in, and one becomes in captivity deeply introspective, and you discover, you know, what might say, the two sides of your character, the light and the dark, whatever you may call it. And you've got to be careful about dwelling too much on the side of yourself which you don't find particularly attractive, and then falling into deep depression. Somehow you have to learn how to recognize you're just a human being like everybody else, and have to work for that reconciliation. But I took it as an opportunity, and I said, each day, live each day as it comes. And you've no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, but just live it now and live it as fully as possible within the confines of that situation. And one can be surprised at how fully one can live it. Even though it's you can do it.
I mean, it brings us to this issue of how what's the long-term legacy? I think things of this kind. See, for many of the wrongly convicted, they that sense of injustice never ever went away. I mean, there was one can I just quote what one person said about where they were left, because it was very striking. This is a man several years after release. I sometimes sit and think, is this all there is? Is this life? What was the purpose of all that suffering? I've no past, and it's up to me to build a future. There's nothing in me to enable me to settle. It's not like it used to be. I lost so many years for nothing. There were no words of sympathy or apology. I can't get away from it. And that, you know, the sense of isolation in that was so strong. And it, you know, it contrasts I thought one of the most remarkable things I ever heard you say in an interview was, I think you were asking to the effect of how are you different from where you might have been if this hadn't happened?
Well,
and you said something to the effect that you look back on it as in terms of what you'd gained, which was extraordinary.
Well, I that's perfectly true. I mean, quite clearly, I wouldn't wish to go through the and if life could have been different, well, fine. But I think there were gifts to be taken from that situation, and one of which is this: that two, maybe, Before captivity, I'd always had sympathy for people who are on the margins of life, prisoners, homeless, whatever. Always had sympathy for them. It's changed to, or developed into empathy. Sympathy to feel sorry for, empathy to know what it's like in your own being to suffer, to have nothing, to be kicked around, to be treated worthless, to be treated unjustly. And to know that in your own being has proved subsequently to be an invaluable gift. And also having had to survive in those extreme circumstances. When I came out, and after a period of time, I mean, my old occupation had been held over for me, and I decided I wasn't going to take it up. I was going to earn my own living by writing and lecturing, and give my time to working with those, or for those, with those, who were on the margins of life, prisoners, the homeless, and hostages, and so on. And prior to captivity, I would never have had courage to give up a salaried occupation. Could have a young family and a mortgage, you know, and I put that dignity and strength, which was proved to be invaluable. And so there were, I think, in all the difficult experiences of life, and extraordinarily difficult for people, much more difficult for some people than I've experienced. But almost in every case, there is something to be gained from it. But it's coming to that realization and not holding resentment. As for my captors, we spoke about one of the hostages going for. I think what helped me was trying to understand why they were behaving as they were behaving. Many of them were young men who had been influenced by a charismatic leader to join a movement to improve their conditions. And once they were in, they were in. There's one example, which I've often given, when John McCarthy was a hostage and Brian Keenan, who were kept together. The food became very bad, and they complained about it, and nothing happened. And eventually the head man came to see them after several months and said, "What are you getting?" Told him. And he said, "That's wrong." So he looked into it and discovered that the guard on duty, the young man on duty, had pocketed half the money given to him, used the other half for food. So they took that young man out and they shot him, killed him on the spot. Because they said, if you betray us, it's small matters. Betray us a big. And so, you know, if you could understand that they joined to improve themselves, to get a better life, they were caught exactly the same or very similar dynamics to the dynamics of drug gangs in this country today, when youngsters join it for that reason. When you can begin to understand that, you can say, well, yes, I can see, I don't agree with what you're doing, but I can understand it. And I think that was a great help to me also. Not to hate them. I mean, yes, at times to be angry. I was often angry. But then I had to learn how to come to terms with anger. I mean, I did write a small poem about anger, which is probably one of the only ones I can write, remember. That is, anger is like you not extinguish the flames totally, but calm yourself by the gentle flow of the embers. In other words, say it's a force that is there, we all have it, but don't allow it to get the better of you, because if it does, it will do you more harm than those against whom it's held. And somehow learning how to cope with anger and cope with all those emotions which do rise on you when something unjust happens to you.
That's just one more question, and then think about the people who are here with us. Think about 1 or 2 questions they can ask afterwards. So, That's the last question.
I think everybody's been in captivity for an hour.
If there's a last question, either you would like to say or something that you say, and then I think we'll open to.
I'm conscious that one whole domain we haven't spoken about, maybe perhaps can't really, which is a whole other story, is what the families go through. Because for the wrongly convicted, their lives, but their family lives, for those families that stayed together, many of them didn't, their lives were turned upside down. I mean, the whole trajectory of life changed. They had poverty, some of them, and the children spoke so movingly, or the children who grew up would look back and say things, I would have liked a childhood, but I didn't have one. They all those families hoped for reconciliation and intimacy when they got back together. And as one said, and again, this is where the literature of war veterans returning home is so pertinent, because you've got all these accounts post the Second World War. One woman who described how the family were taken on holiday, and there was just something, it would all be wonderful with Daddy safely back in charge. And she said it didn't happen, nor could it ever happen. And that the sadness of that the permanent damage that was done to family life was one of the most saddest things that came across these interviews. But again, indirectly, because those families needed as much time as the individuals who've been convicted did, and they have very little recognition. And again, that resonates at all with what you've seen in the experience of hostages and the families of hostages. I mean, you would have done work with them in the years since your release.
Yeah, well, that does resonate very much so, because I co-founded Hostage International a number of years ago, almost 30 years ago now. And we've worked quietly ever since. And the main purpose of that is to be supportive of the family whilst the individual in the family is taken hostage, and to be with them right through that experience. And when the hostage hopefully returns, to be with them too, recognizing the fact that it's very punishing for them, very, very, very difficult, particularly for children. And I have seen it time and time again, exactly the same experience with hostage families. And my own family, it changed us. Yes, it did change us. I don't think it's changed us detrimentally, but it has changed us. We are always changing in life, but this dramatic experience changed the course of all our lives. You see, but on the other hand, it needn't be totally detrimental. I thought that my captivity would have so affected my children that they would have walked out of education, walked out of college, whatever. As it happens, all four went and got their degrees, and went on, moved on. So it does depend on what support you get.
Yes.
And what understanding you get from those who are trying to deal with this situation.
Yeah, and as I said, one of the things that's been heartening is seeing a few of the people I saw, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, years and years and years later, in a much happier state, and with something with new relationships, or relationships with grandchildren, something that's happened new that has given them a kind of new context of life they didn't anticipate. Those kinds of things can happen, but in the times I saw them, I remember thinking that the closest clinical experience I had to seeing wrongly convicted after release from the families was like the aftermath of somebody who suffered a catastrophic head injury, where you just know that there's permanent damage and it can't be, the person they were can't be reconstituted, and the line can be reconstituted. That's what it felt like. But it, that turned out not to be the case in the very long term for some.
Well, I can think, going into your area, I mean, I'm in contact with a number of prisoners, some of whom I do believe have been wrongfully convicted. And one I think of in particular, who has taken the approach that, in a different way, that I too think, and made creative use of the time. So in captivity, he's got 2 degrees and he's hoping to go on for his PhD. And when he gets out, he said he is going to work within the criminal justice system. And so he said, I think without this experience, I doubt whether I would have done these 2 degrees. I doubt whether I would have done it at all. And he's taken that attitude and viewed it as positively as he can. And I really do think he's one who is wrongfully convicted. I'm quite sure of it. Well, as for sure as you can. So this is possible. It doesn't happen. And the final thing I would just say is not to hold bitterness and anger forever. I went back to meet my captors some years later in an attempt to build a reconciliation. They did actually apologize. Interestingly enough. So there we are.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating dialogue to both of you. You both touched on issues of captivity, notion of fairness around issues of captivity, and issues of emotional regulation, prospering after the traumatic event, and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering, from your own expertise in these 2 different settings, obviously, what is the best strategies that you would suggest putting forward for those hostages that are currently, hopefully more, will be released in the recent Israel-Hamas war, to the extent that we are able to confer, ideally, resilience to these individuals, but not only confer resilience, but even if possible, maybe daydreaming, if possible, to make them ambassadors for peacemaking and breaking this unnecessary sort of cycle of violence with similar arguments that go back and forth and are equally valid in their own truths among the 2 communities. It was a very long statement, but
I'm afraid in my 85th year, I have difficulty in understanding. May I ask the question to be repeated succinctly?
I think the first part in particular was about what can you do better to support these and is there any scope for involving them in peaceful activities?
Yeah, well, what we could do better, we always do better, yes. But Hostage International was set up precisely because the Foreign Office at the time were not, on their own admission, dealing adequately for a variety of reasons with that particular problem. And we set it up, and we now have teams of specialist people working not just in this country but around the world, giving support and help to hostages according to their need as they need it. So that is taking place with the full cooperation of the British Foreign Office and foreign offices abroad. So that is now being done. And we also now engage in the training of Foreign Office staff to deal with that problem. So things are being done. but we do not talk about it. We do keep a lot of the work totally confidential. Partly because, for many reasons, protect the families, but also because we must be seen to be politically neutral, and that's extremely difficult in many situations. And we do keep politically neutral. I mean, this last week I've been asked to comment on the situation. I'm just in the Middle East. I'm just holding my fire for the moment, because that situation is so polarized, within which I've worked many times. I'm just holding off on that one for the moment. And we'll deal with the families, or work with the families as they come to us on a confidential and quiet basis.
I mean, just on the with reference to the wrongly convicted, I think that the model of care and support is provided for hostages on release, and that indeed that you continue to provide for hostages and families is very much the kind of model that many wrongly convicted people need, but their public profile isn't the same, and it's been much more of a struggle to get services in place for them.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And my question was around, it sounded like it was very useful to be able to sort of try to understand why captors hadn't, the reasons for what they're doing, but also the interventions afterwards years later. And it occurred to me that that's something that works very differently with the wrongfully convicted, right? In terms of either you've got this kind of big nebulous kind of state that, has sort of wronged you that you can't really necessarily sort of speak to or meet or ask. I was wondering how people, if they talked about their sort of interactions with people like prison officers or other kind of members of law enforcement, and what that was like.
Well, it's a complicated issue, that the story for many of them was of progressive loss of a sense of legitimacy in the power of the state. They would initially assume that the police would know that they were innocent, that when they were remanded in custody they'd just be released because it was a mistake. Then they put their faith in the trial and assume they'll be acquitted, and they're not acquitted. Then they put their faith in the appeal procedures, and those fail. And then the CCRC, and sometimes that fails. So their faith in the criminal justice system erodes and erodes and erodes, and it extends to authority generally, or can do. So that sense of injustice, it goes very deep. So they feel that their worth is not recognised, and of course they don't get apologies. I mean, and so much more could be done post convictions being quashed to provide apologies, to provide public recognition where people were at fault, and that hardly ever happens. So that they're just not left with the sense that no one has been brought to justice for what's happened to me. It's happened for no purpose. And I think that's very different from people who are correctly convicted, where they know that at one level the system's working.
Yes, so I have, thank you so much for tonight. I have two questions. The first is surrounding, you spoke of how when you were in captivity that you didn't know how long how long you'd be in captivity. And I just can't imagine the magnitude of despair that uncertainty would bring. And so I'm just curious how you went about dealing with that uncertainty, and perhaps like cultivating hope? Did you tell yourself that it would end? Did you shut it out completely? I'm curious about how you dealt with that. And then my second question is different. The second question is, you mentioned support services being so important when you returned and reintegrated for both you and your family. And I'm just curious what you found to be the most helpful, specifically.
Yeah, well, on the first one, learning to live for the moment. I mean, I was told on several occasions I was going to be released over those period of 5 years. They come into the cell and they say, "You're going." And on one occasion, I was actually put into a private house for a week prior to being released. And instead of being released, I was put back into. So you get used to that. And you cope with it by saying, live for today, live for now, live as fully as you can now. There's nothing you can do to influence what's going to happen tomorrow. So try and live for now. That's the only way I could deal with it. And others maybe deal with it differently. That's the way I dealt with it. And the second one, your second point was, sorry?
So regarding support services when you reintegrated.
Support services, when I came, well, they were as good as they were, and they've improved tremendously over the last 30 years, there's no doubt about that. And these were the very early days of giving support to hostages, with very little known about it. I mean, today, I doubt whether they'd have 25 family members greeting you all at once. They wouldn't do it now. They recognise that that is not an appropriate way to behave. So for its time, it was very helpful. They'd be able to sit down individually and each tell our story to a trained listener, and sometimes a psychiatrist or sometimes another profession. That was extremely useful. But as I say, it's developed so much today. It's so much better now than it ever was.
Hi, thank you so much sharing your experience with us. I have my questions to Adrian regarding wrongful conviction. So I was reading the Caroline Hoyle's work on CCRC, which was an empirical study on CCRC decision making. I noticed that scientific evidence is a big deciding factor for setting the cases for reconsideration. And it was mostly seen that in cases where there was strong scientific evidence to prove that this person was wrongly convicted, sort of became a deciding factor. Given the fact that psychological or psychiatric evaluations are also seen as an expert evidence in this process, so when you are involved in the process as an expert or as a scientific expert, how do you negotiate your power, your position in the process? Like, do you see your position purely as someone who's assessing the person, the case, or do you also see it as, somehow you are deciding what compensation is or what miscarriage of justice is? Sort of, how do you negotiate your position as a...
Well, I'm just on the question of the assessments for compensation. First of all, the wrongly convicted person has to be deemed eligible for compensation, and the test for that nowadays is extremely narrow. And in fact, our current test has been tested in the Supreme Court for its compatibility with the European Convention, and it's now been appealed to Strasbourg, and it's before the Strasbourg Court now. But now you're only entitled to compensation essentially if there's some new fact that shows beyond reasonable doubt you could not have committed the offence. And I think I did look back at the 64 people that I've seen. I think that test is probably only met in no more than half a dozen of them. And so the eligibility for compensation used to be, for a number of reasons, much broader than it is nowadays. There's quite an important issue actually about and quite difficult issues about the limits of expert evidence in this particular context, because conventionally a psychiatric expert would be seen as an expert in the assessment and diagnosis of mental disorder. For the wrongly convicted, whether or not they suffer from mental disorder, which of course many of them do, is a very small part of the story. What's really important is the much wider impact on their life histories and on their psychological and social adjustment. And I took the view that those, all that had to be mapped out as accurately and carefully and thoroughly as possible. And it went way beyond the conventional remit, actually, of diagnosis. But I think that was important. There was some comfort in the fact that the ways in which assessors of compensation, or the principle that lies behind compensation, is the idea that you have to think about how might the person's life have been but for the wrongful conviction. So therefore you do have to think beyond diagnosis. It's always a comfort, and of course that when I did these reports, the thing that was always really reassuring was if a person read the report and said, well, not just yes, that's right, but yes, that makes sense of what I've been through. It was, you know, it was that striving for authentic description, which was, you know, in Alison's term. Anyway, that's a rather rambling answer to at least.
I think I don't just think I'd comment on that. I think once you're caught in the criminal justice system and you're innocent and you're caught in it, how extraordinarily difficult it is to be released from it. Extraordinarily difficult. Now, what was it? The criminal review? What's the
Criminal Cases Review Commission?
Criminal Cases Review Commission. Isn't it true that about only 5% of cases that refer to them actually succeed? 5%, 95% dismissed for one reason or another. And partly it's argued that that commission is under-resourced in terms of money and staff, and does not go into full detail of the case, does not investigate it for the technical staff all the time. Now that is terribly unjust. That's totally wrong. But I've seen it time and time again. There's one case I know of a man who convicted of murder on the evidence of a forensic scientist who was a young forensic scientist, just starting his career, an expert witness. Subsequent to that, 9 eminent forensic scientists say it would be impossible for the murder to be committed in the way that it was. 9 opposed the mark, but because that evidence was there, and because new evidence is not brought forth, he still remains in jail. So there are real grave difficulties facing anybody who's in wrongfully by the system itself. The system needs some degree of reformation or refunding.
Yeah, I mean the CCRC has very impressive powers, statutory powers. It's a very good model, but its resources are a different story.
That's right.
And they can't afford to investigate as many cases as they ought to.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but the last 5 years I've been a member of the IMB. You know about the IMBs, the Independent Monitoring Board, which visit prisons. So I've been visiting HMP Bedford every week for the last 5 years. So I'm very interested in the ideas you've both been expressing in relation to my experience talking to prisoners now. You both have very clear and moving experiences of being incarcerated, obviously wrongly, and Adrian's work on people who've been clearly, or it seems anyway, have been wrongly convicted in their experiences. And we've touched upon this already in the discussion. Those prisoners which there are many. I mean, I would possibly estimate about half of the prisoners I've ever talked to who told me they'd been wrongly convicted. Now, whether judgment was subject to scrutiny and was found to be correct or not, they certainly believed it. So one of the questions that was in my mind is, has there been any research done on, as it were, prisoners who believe that they're wrongly convicted, whether or not say that would turn out to be the case? And are there similarities between those who kind of people that agents seen over the years where a judgment has been made that they've been wrongly convicted? So is it the perception of being wrongly committed or wrongly convicted, or is it the reality that's really important? That's the first question. And then the second question goes on from that, and I think now everybody knows the situation in prisons now is absolutely awful. And nearly all prisoners are being banged up in their cells for 22, 23 hours a day, which is not what they expected, to happen to them when they went to prison. And is it fanciful to think that they would have some experiences again similar to the kind of extremes that you both have studied, because of the current state of our prisons, where there aren't enough staff and there aren't enough activities, and COVID hasn't been reversed, and every prisoner almost is being banged up, for 23, 24 hours a day. There's two questions. One is it the perception that's important? And the other is there any analogy, or am I just speculating that, as it were, the experience of all prisoners is a bit like being?
I think the first thing I would say to that is that I have great sympathy for the parole board, because my experience of working with prisoners across the years is that a fairly large proportion eventually convince themselves that they're innocent. I don't know if that's me, and really believe that they're wrongfully imprisoned. So trying to discern and differentiate between those who are genuinely innocent and those who say they're innocent and believe it, but clearly are not, is an extraordinarily difficult task. And I don't know, I leave you to deal with the other question.
No, it is very difficult. And I don't know of any research that points to answering that question. Of course, the sense that prisoners can have of being unjustly convicted or unjustly sentenced can be very pervasive and extensive. And there are difficult grey areas where people have been involved in in a group or in an accessory role in a crime, but didn't commit it, but they're convicted of it. Things of that kind. One thing that was distinctive, I think, about the people who really were wrongly convicted, or where it was found ultimately the judgment was made on the facts that they were wrongly convicted, was the sheer persistence of their maintenance of innocence and the cost of it. So there were people who said, "I will, if I'm given life license, I will not go. I will not leave this prison as a convicted offender," right? What I said, "I'm quite prepared to remain in prison for the rest of my natural life rather than give a confession to something I'm innocent of." I don't maintain innocence because I seek release from prison. I maintain innocence. I maintain innocence because I am innocent. That's a kind of difference.
I have seen that on a number of occasions where a prisoner has been offered, suggested he would plead for manslaughter rather than murder, and he said, "I am not doing that." He would have been released after 7 years. And I think of one man now who served 33 years because he refuses. He was offered that plea, he refused it, and he's now served 33 years, and will still not say he was guilty.
Yeah,
So this is a real
Sorry,
difficulty.
it is, and of course, during sentence, the people like that will refuse to participate in any offence-focused programs, or may well
That's
be,
right.
and they'll be judged by forensic psychologists to be in denial, not accepting responsibility for their offences, not making progress, and so on and so forth, and dangerous because of their non-acceptance of responsibility.
Yeah, and I've seen that. I mean, I've seen it in working in prison in New Zealand, discussing this with a prisoner, and he said, I'm going to have to plead guilty because otherwise I shall never ever be with my children and family again. And so he did, and of course then he can go through the courses, go through the hoop and come out.
Yeah.
It's a matter of doing the courses.
Yeah.
And it's not right. It's not right, it's wrong. This is why I say review and revision is so important now in the prison system, in the criminal justice system.
It's not so much a question as a comment, because as you've been talking, I've been thinking about the case of Andy Malkinson, who served 17 years in prison, and scientific evidence eventually proved that DNA evidence proved that he had not committed the offence of rape, which he'd been accused. And he seems remarkably resilient in a way. I don't know whether people heard him on the radio one morning on the Today programme, Radio 4, BBC 4, when he was very articulate, and actually he seems to have used creative possibilities to challenge the criminal justice system, especially in relation to the idea that he might be charged board and lodging for the 17 years that he's spent in prison. And Alex Chalk, as Secretary of Justice, is going to look into that. So I think it's claimed that the civil servants and politicians didn't know that that was happening. But it's someone who seems to have used his anger, his frustration in a positive, creative way to challenge the whole system.
Yeah.
And I did just want to say, in response to your questions, your IMB experiences, that there is research on those who've been imprisoned for public protection, sentenced correctly in the first place, but then forever languishing in prison with a great sense of injustice and no hope. And some of my research is on deaths after release from prison. Very high rate of suicide about 8 days after people leave prison, because they're just destroyed by the experience.
Someone said to me, what do you think of Beirut? I said, wonderful. I had 5 years free board and lodging.
The things we haven't talked about is throw weights and for all of us at the same time. I was thinking, when the rain was, I was thinking, oh no, we can't end on that note. And then Terry, bless it. Stop here, we can continue, so please stay and join us for a further chat and drinks. And thank you all for coming and for all your questions. But thank you most of all to Terry and Adrian for sharing their experiences with us.